The village rests under a heavy blanket of morning frost, waiting for the first light to breach the wooden shutters. Wood smoke drifts low across the hardened earth, carrying the sharp scent of oak and old ash. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If these quiet histories bring you comfort, you're always welcome to return by subscribing. You open your eyes to the dense chill of a medieval morning, the air in your small sleeping chamber holding the lingering bite of frost. The narrow bed beneath you is little more than a straw-filled tick, offering sparse comfort against the rigid wooden frame. You hear the deep bronze voice of the church bell ringing somewhere across the village, its steady tone cutting through the gray dawn. Your mother moves in the room below, her footsteps rhythmic against the packed earth floor. You lie still for a moment beneath a heavy wool blanket, breathing in the scent of damp thatch and dried yarrow hanging from the rafters. You pull the rough fabric closer to your chin, gathering the last remnants of sleep before the day demands your labor. Downstairs, the hearth fire breathes a low orange light against the stone walls. The fire is never allowed to extinguish, merely banked beneath ash to preserve the precious coals for the morning. Smoke seeps upward through the floorboards, carrying the familiar smell of burning wood and ancient dust. The cottage is small and practical, built of heavy timber and wattle, designed to withstand the harshness of the early season. A rooster crows in the distance toward the millers, holding a harsh sound, breaking the lingering stillness. The world beyond the wooden shutters remains hidden, locked in the quiet moments before the sun crests the horizon. You push the blanket aside and swing your legs over the edge of the bed. Your bare feet meet the freezing dirt floor, the surface worn smooth by years of constant tread. You reach for your overdress in the dim light, the heavy woolen garment you wore to sleep, and pull it quickly over your head. You lace the front with practiced fingers, the fabric scratching slightly against your skin, a sensation you have known since childhood. You locate your soft leather shoes by feel alone, slipping them onto your feet to ward off the biting cold. You stand in the narrow space of your chamber, ready to face the endless tasks that keep a medieval household alive. You pick up a length of plain linen and begin the careful process of covering your hair. You wind the fabric tight around your head, tucking the loose ends securely at the nape of your neck. Loose hair is a danger around the spinning wheel and a nuisance when carding raw fleece. You descend the steep wooden ladder to the main room, each rung smooth beneath your palms. Your mother does not look up from the hearth, her attention focused entirely on coaxing flames from the glowing red embers. You step away from the ladder, feeling the subtle shift in temperature as you draw closer to the warming stones. The main room of the cottage holds the scent of yesterday's labor and today's necessity. A shallow pan of water sits near the fire, catching the flickering light on its surface. Your younger brother huddles in the far corner, gnawing quietly on a hardened crust of dark rye bread. The space is perhaps 20 feet across, dominated by the stone hearth at one end and the wooden tools of your trade along the walls. Shadows dance across the ceiling beams where bundles of dried herbs hang, waiting for the cooking pot or the sickbed. This single room contains the entirety of your family's daily existence, a sanctuary built against the elements. You move toward the shelf where the spinning wheels rest in the shadows. You pull your wheel closer to the hearth, positioning it where the morning light will eventually fall. The wood of the frame is dark and polished from the constant friction of your hands over the past year. You check the spindle with a careful touch, noting the half-finished thread waiting to be spun. You trace the drive band to ensure it sits properly on the wheel, preparing the tool for the hours of work ahead. You hear your mother rise from the fire, the rustle of her wool dress signaling the next phase of the morning. Your mother hands you a wooden bowl filled with reheated pottage from the evening before. You hold the bowl in both hands, letting the residual heat warm your stiff fingers. You eat standing near the fire, tasting the thin broth of barley, water, and bits of old turnip. The meal is humble but necessary, providing the sustenance required for the heavy lifting to come. You watch your mother sort through a basket of dried yarrow, her hands moving with unthinking efficiency. She separates the intact flowers from the broken stems, setting aside the best pieces for healing remedies. "Fetch water," your mother says, her voice low and practical in the quiet room. You set the empty wooden bowl on the table and wipe your mouth with the back of your hand. You gather the wooden bucket sitting by the door, looping the rope handles over your arms. You carry 2 large buckets and 1 smaller one, their weight awkward even when empty. You push the heavy wooden door open, letting the crisp morning air flood into the smoky cottage. You step out into the pale light, leaving the warmth of the hearth behind. The village lane stretches out before you, rutted by cartwheels and frozen solid. The sky is a bruised purple, slowly yielding to the dull gray of early daylight. Chickens scratch uselessly at the hardened earth outside a neighbor's wattle fence. The distant rhythmic strike of the blacksmith hammer begins to echo off the stone walls of the distant church. You can see the faint green shoots of winter wheat emerging in the fields beyond the settlement. The smell of frost and wet earth fills your lungs, a sharp contrast to the stale air of the cottage. You walk the familiar path toward the communal well near the center of the village. You pass Goodwife Emma's cottage, spotting her standing in the doorway with an infant resting on her hip. You offer a small wave acknowledging the shared burden of the early morning routine. You feel the cold seeping through the thin soles of your leather shoes with every step. You keep your eyes on the ground, avoiding the deepest ruts and patches of treacherous ice. You listen to the creak of the wooden buckets swinging against your legs, a steady rhythm marking your progress. At the well, you find Agnes already waiting, her breath pluming in the cold air. You greet her with a quiet nod, stepping up to the stone edge to help haul the heavy rope. You grasp the rough hemp with both hands, feeling the familiar burn as you pull the laden bucket upward. The water sloshes over the side, freezing instantly on the stone blocks beneath your feet. You pour the freezing water into your own buckets, careful not to spill a precious drop. You listen to Agnes speak about the baker's oven and the long lines expected by midday. You hoist the first heavy bucket onto your hip, adjusting your posture to bear the weight. You grip the smaller bucket in the same hand, your knuckles white against the cold wood. You grasp the second large bucket with your free hand, feeling the immediate strain in your shoulders. You begin the slow walk back to the cottage, your steps measured and careful to avoid slipping. You feel the water shifting inside the wooden slats, threatening to throw you off balance. You ignore the ache building in your lower back, focusing only on the door of your family's home. Inside the cottage, the temperature has risen marginally thanks to the roaring fire. Your mother has spread a clean linen cloth over the floor, preparing the space for the morning's labor. You set the heavy buckets down by the hearth, gasping slightly as the burden leaves your arms. You stretch your hands out toward the flames, trying to chase the numbness from your fingertips. You see the raw fleece waiting in a woven basket, still carrying the grease and dirt of the sheep. You know, the tedious process of carding must begin before the sun is fully up. You sit opposite your mother on a low wooden stool, taking up a pair of flat, wire-toothed paddles. You pull a handful of the raw wool from the basket, picking out a stubborn piece of dried bramble. You press the fleece onto the lower paddle, feeling the oily texture of the lanolin against your skin. You drag the upper paddle across the wire teeth, forcing the tangled fibers to align in a single direction. You pass the tool back to your mother, maintaining a steady, silent rhythm. You repeat this motion endlessly, your mind detaching from the repetitive strain of the work. The scrape of wire teeth against wire teeth fills the small room, a harsh metallic sound. The smell of raw sheep fleece overpowers the scent of the wood smoke, thick and earthy. Your hands begin to cramp from gripping the wooden handles, a dull ache settling into your palms. You watch the pile of neatly rolled, carded wool grow slowly beside the hearth. You understand that this tedious preparation is the only way to ensure the spun thread will be strong and even. You keep your eyes focused on the wire teeth, letting the morning slip away into mindless labor. You brush the wire teeth through the wool again, the motion wearing a blister into the side of your thumb. You ignore the stinging pain, adjusting your grip to shift the pressure to a different part of your hand. You watch your mother sort through the next fleece, her experienced eyes finding the matted sections that require extra washing. You listen to the sound of your younger brother sweeping the packed earth floor with a broom made of tied birch twigs. You hand over the next finished roll of fiber, watching it join the growing stack of prepared material. You flex your stiff fingers during the brief pause, preparing for the next handful of raw fleece. The sunlight finally breaches the cracks in the wooden shutters, casting harsh golden lines across the dusty air. The light illuminates the floating particles of wool, making the air look thick and substantial. A neighbor knocks twice on the heavy wooden door before pushing it open, bringing a gust of cold wind into the room. She carries a woven sack over her shoulder, bulging with the fleece from her family's small flock of sheep. The women exchange brief greetings, their voices low and practical as they negotiate the terms of the labor. You keep your head down and continue carding, knowing better than to interrupt the business of the household. You take the new fleece from the neighbor's sack, noting how the texture differs from the previous batch. You feel the coarseness of the fibers, realizing this wool will be harder to comb and spin. You separate a small clump, pulling apart the worst of the tangles with your bare hands before applying the wire teeth. You press down hard with the upper paddle, forcing the stubborn material to yield to the metal bristles. You hear your mother agree to a trade of 1 measure of rye grain for the finished carding. You understand the value of your sore hands in the currency of winter survival. The fire pops loudly, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the stone chimney. The heat presses against your face, drying your skin and making your eyes water in the smoky air. The neighbor departs, leaving behind the heavy sack and a lingering scent of cold wind and livestock. Your mother pulls the water pan away from the hottest coals, using a thick folded cloth to protect her hands from the hot iron. She pours a small amount into a clay cup, offering you a brief respite from the relentless work. You drink the warm, metallic-tasting water, quickly eager to return to the rhythm of the paddles. You settle back onto the wooden stool, the ache in your lower back throbbing with a dull persistence. You pick up the carding paddles, the handles warm from your previous grip. You scrape the wire teeth together, the rhythmic sound drowning out the distant noise of the village. You focus on the precise alignment of the fibers, ensuring no knots remain to ruin the eventual thread. You feel a strange sense of satisfaction as the chaotic fleece transforms into uniform, manageable rolls. You know this work will consume the rest of your morning, chaining you to the hearth until the midday meal. By the time the church bell rings to mark the middle of the day, the pile of uncarded fleece has vanished. Your mother stands and stretches her spine, a sharp crack echoing in the quiet cottage. She moves toward the wooden table, bringing out the remaining loaf of dark rye bread and a small wheel of hard cheese. She cuts thick slices with an iron knife, handing you a portion along with a cup of weak ale. The ale is bitter and flat, but it washes away the dust that has coated the back of your throat. You sit on the floor by the fire to eat, resting your tired arms on your knees. You chew the dense bread slowly, letting the hard crust soften before swallowing. You break off a piece of the sharp cheese, savoring the salty fat that provides essential energy for the afternoon. You watch the flames consume a thick oak log, the bark curling and blackening in the intense heat. You hear the heavy footsteps of your father approaching the cottage, his boots striking the frozen ground with rhythmic force. You finish your meal quickly, standing up to help clear the wooden table before he enters. You know his arrival means a shift in the household dynamic, bringing the scent of the fields into the cramped space. The door swings open, framing your father against the bright, cold light of the midday sun. He steps inside, pulling off his thick wool cap and shaking the loose dirt from his tunic. His face is weathered and lined, the skin around his eyes pale where he squints against the glare of the winter sky. He drops a broken iron hoe onto the packed earth floor, the metal clanking sharply against the hidden stone. He moves straight to the fire, rubbing his calloused hands together over the flames to drive the cold from his joints. Your mother hands him his portion of bread and cheese without speaking, a silent exchange born of long habit. You carry your empty cup to the bucket, rinsing it carefully with a splash of cold water. You return to the spinning wheel, knowing the carded wool must now be transformed into thread. You sit on the high wooden stool, placing your right foot on the worn treadle. You take the first roll of soft fleece, pinching the end between your thumb and forefinger to attach it to the spindle. You press down on the treadle, setting the large wheel in motion with a smooth, continuous spin. You feel the tension in the thread build, the fibers twisting together under the guidance of your hands. The flyer blurs as it rotates, winding the newly formed thread onto the wooden bobbin. The hum of the spinning wheel fills the cottage, a low, constant vibration that seems to settle into the walls. Your father eats in silence, his eyes fixed on the broken hoe resting near the door. He murmurs something about the frost heaving the soil, making the digging treacherous and slow. Your mother nods, returning to her own wheel to begin spinning the finer wool meant for a merchant's cloth. The family works together in a shared, unspoken rhythm, bound by the necessity of constant labor. You adjust the tension on the drive band, noticing the thread becoming slightly too thin and fragile. You slow the treadle, allowing more fiber to feed into the twist before it winds onto the bobbin. You watch the thread carefully, trying to maintain an even thickness that won't snap in the loom. You feel the familiar ache returning to your shoulders as you hold your arms elevated and steady. You lose yourself in the spinning motion, the repetitive task leaving your mind free to wander the confines of the small room. You spin until the bobbin is full, the afternoon light slowly stretching across the packed earth floor. You step away from the spinning wheel, your muscles protesting the sudden change in posture. The wooden stool scrapes against the hard dirt floor, a harsh sound in the muted cottage. Your mother does not look up from her own work, her hands moving with unhurried precision over the fine merchant wool. The wooden spindle sits heavy with fresh thread, a tangible measure of your labor. You stretch your arms above your head, feeling the tight pull in your shoulders ease marginally. The day is far from over, and the garden plot behind the house requires attention before the sun vanishes. You pull your overdress tighter against the lingering draft, preparing to face the biting wind once more. Outside, the afternoon light has turned thin and pale, casting distorted shadows across the frozen ruts of the lane. The cold bites straight through to the bone, finding every gap in your layered clothing. Several village dogs bark in the distance, their voices sharp and clear in the crisp air. The smell of burning oak hangs low, trapping the wood smoke close to the ground. A flock of small brown sparrows scatters from a bare elm tree, a sudden burst of frantic motion. You walk past the wattle fence holding your neighbor's goats, their yellow eyes tracking your passage with mild interest. You reach the small patch of turned earth behind your family's cottage, the soil hardened by the retreating winter. This strip of land measures perhaps 20 feet by 30, yet it holds the key to your family's survival through the coming months. You pick up a heavy iron hoe leaning against the stone foundation, its wooden handle smooth from years of friction. The metal blade bears the scars of countless rocks and stubborn roots, chipped but still functional. You raise the tool and bring it down hard against a stubborn clod of earth, the impact jarring your wrists. The frozen top layer yields reluctantly, revealing the darker, richer soil resting beneath the surface frost. Dark earth crumbles under the repeated strikes of the heavy hoe, releasing a sharp, mineral scent into the chill air. The work demands a physical rhythm, a repeated lifting and dropping that forces your breath to emerge in white plumes. You clear a narrow row, kicking aside a jagged piece of flint that surfaces from the depths. Your father cleared this plot years ago, yet the ground always seems to push new stones upward over the winter. The labor is brutal and necessary, demanding every ounce of your strength. You pause to wipe a smear of dirt from your forehead, leaning on the hoe for a fleeting moment of rest. You drop to your knees in the freshly broken soil, ignoring the damp cold seeping through your thick wool dress. The ground feels coarse and unyielding beneath your bare fingers as you begin to break the smaller clods apart. You drag your hands through the dirt, feeling for hidden roots or buried stones that might hinder the tender spring shoots. A fat earthworm wriggles frantically from the disturbed soil, seeking the safety of the dark underground. You trace a shallow trench with your thumb, establishing a straight line for the first row of seeds. The physical contact with the land anchors you, connecting your labor directly to the promise of future harvest. Small cloth bags hang from a leather cord around your waist, holding the dried seeds saved from the previous autumn. These precious reserves mean the difference between sustenance and starvation when the harsh weather returns. You untie the first pouch, your cold fingers struggling slightly with the stiff knot. You pour a handful of wrinkled peas into your palm, their pale green skins dusty and dry. You carefully place them into the shallow trench, spacing them exactly as your mother taught you. The distance must be perfect, allowing each plant enough soil to draw nourishment without crowding its neighbor. You cover the seeds with a layer of loose earth, patting the surface firm with the flat of your hand. The task forces you to hunch forward, straining the muscles in your lower back that already ache from the spinning wheel. You move down the row on your knees, repeating the meticulous process until the first bag hangs empty. You open the next pouch, finding the tiny black specks of cabbage seed waiting inside. These require a lighter touch, a mere sprinkling over the soil followed by a dusting of fine dirt. You work with focused intent, knowing a late frost could still destroy this fragile beginning. Across the thatched rooftops, the blacksmith's hammer strikes a different cadence, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that signals the forging of a plowshare. The sound echoes off the stone walls of the distant church, a constant reminder of the village's interconnected labor. You hear the creak of a wooden cart rolling down the main lane, the wheels struggling against the frozen mud. The miller's heavy voice shouts a command to his draft horse, the sound carrying easily on the thin wind. Every noise tells a story of survival, a collective effort to push back against the harsh realities of the season. You listen to these familiar sounds, finding a strange comfort in the shared struggle of your community. You stand up and stretch your cramped legs, brushing the clinging dirt from the knees of your dress. The sun has dipped lower in the sky, painting the scattered clouds with strokes of bruised purple and dull orange. The temperature plummets as the direct light fades, hardening the ground you just managed to turn. You gather the iron hoe and the empty seed bags, your hands numb and stiff from the exposure. You walk toward the small wooden pen attached to the side of the cottage, where the family's livestock waits for the evening feed. The pig grunts in anticipation, thrusting its wet snout against the rough timber slats. Scrap wood and woven branches form the crude enclosure, smelling sharply of manure and damp animal hair. The family's 3 chickens huddle together on a low perch, their feathers fluffed against the biting chill. You reach into a woven basket hanging from a peg, pulling out a handful of dried grain sweepings mixed with vegetable scraps. You scatter the feed across the frozen ground, watching the birds descend with frantic, jerky movements. You pour a bucket of slops into the wooden trough for the pig, stepping back to avoid the aggressive surge of the hungry animal. You check the wooden latch on the gate, ensuring it holds tight against potential predators. You carry the empty bucket back toward the cottage door, your breath catching as a sudden gust of wind cuts across the yard. The village is settling into a different phase of existence, the loud labor of the day transitioning into the hushed preparations for dusk. You see your neighbor, Goodwife Kate, hurrying along the lane with a bundle of gathered kindling under her arm. She offers a brief nod, but does not stop to speak, her priority focused on reaching the warmth of her own hearth. You pull the heavy wooden door open, stepping over the raised threshold and back into the smoky interior. The transition from the freezing air to the stifling heat of the room makes your skin prickle with sudden warmth. Firelight paints the stone walls in shifting shades of gold and deep shadow, transforming the humble space into a secure sanctuary. Your father sits on a low bench near the hearth, carefully running a whetstone along the edge of a rusted iron sickle. The scraping noise fills the room, a steady rasp that sets your teeth on edge. Your mother stands by the wooden table, using a thick wooden spoon to stir a fresh pot of pottage simmering over the flames. She adds a handful of dried onions to the broth, the sharp scent blooming instantly in the confined space. You set the empty bucket in its designated corner, waiting for your next instruction. You step toward the wooden shelf, holding the family's modest collection of clay bowls and carved spoons. You gather the vessels, wiping dust from their surfaces with a rough linen cloth. You place them carefully on the table, arranging them alongside the remaining heel of dark rye bread. You notice the deep grooves worn into the tabletop, evidence of countless meals shared in this exact spot. The wood is stained with spilled ale and rendered fat, a map of your family's sustenance over the passing years. You arrange the iron knife beside the bread, its handle bound in worn leather cord. The scent of the boiling pottage grows stronger, a savory mixture of ancient peas, barley, and the sharp bite of dried herbs. Your stomach twists with genuine hunger, reminding you of the meager midday meal that burned away during your labor in the garden. You watch your mother taste the broth from the wooden spoon, her face unreadable in the flickering light. She reaches for a small clay jar, extracting a pinch of coarse salt to add to the simmering liquid. Salt is a precious commodity, guarded carefully and used only when necessary to preserve food or elevate a sparse meal. You know the addition of the salt means the day has been judged productive enough to warrant the luxury. You fetch a bundle of dried rushlights from a wooden box near the door, preparing to combat the encroaching darkness. Candles made of tallow are too expensive for ordinary evenings, reserved only for special occasions or the sick room. You dip the dried rushes into a pan of leftover animal fat, coating the pith to ensure a steady burn. You secure one of the prepared rushes into an iron holder on the table, striking a spark from flint to light the tip. The small flame sputters and catches, casting a weak, greasy light over the wooden bowls. The smell of burning fat mingles with the wood smoke and cooking food, creating the distinct aroma of a medieval dusk. Shadows deepen in the corners of the cottage, obscuring the spinning wheels and the hanging bundles of carded wool. The single rushlight provides barely enough illumination to see the faces of your family members gathering around the table. Your father sets the sharpened sickle aside, wiping his calloused hands on the coarse fabric of his tunic. He takes his place at the head of the table, his posture slumped from the exhaustion of the fields. Your younger brother scrambles up onto the bench, his eyes fixed eagerly on the steaming iron pot. You stand beside your mother waiting for the food to be portioned out into the clay bowls. You receive your portion of the thick stew, wrapping your cold hands around the heated clay to draw warmth into your skin. You sit on a low stool near the edge of the firelight, the heat from the hearth warming your back. The broth is scalding hot, forcing you to eat slowly, blowing on each spoonful before it touches your lips. The barley is soft and filling, providing a heavy weight in your empty stomach. You listen to the sounds of your family eating, the scrape of wooden spoons against clay, and the tearing of dense bread. The silence is comfortable. A shared acknowledgement of a difficult day survived together. Outside the thick timber walls, the wind begins to howl, rattling the wooden shutters with unexpected force. The temperature continues to drop, bringing the threat of a hard freeze that might endanger the newly planted seeds. You try not to worry about the garden plot, knowing the earth must simply endure whatever the sky decides to deliver. You focus on the taste of the sharp onion in the pottage, chewing slowly to make the meal last longer. Your father speaks quietly about the Lord's demands for the upcoming week, detailing the ditch digging required on the Domrémy lands. His voice is flat and resigned, stating the facts of their obligations without complaint or expectation of change. You finish the last drop of the broth, using a small crust of bread to wipe the bowl clean. You stand and collect the empty vessels from the table, stacking them near the water bucket for washing. The rushlight burns down quickly, its flame dipping and hissing as it reaches the end of the fat-soaked pith. You light a second rush, pushing the blackened remains of the first into the ashes of the hearth. The simple chores of the evening bring a measure of peace, a routine that requires no thought and carries no anxiety. You fetch a wet cloth and wipe down the wooden table, removing the crumbs and scattered spills. The cottage holds the heat of the fire well, the thick walls of wattle and daub insulating the space against the bitter night. Your mother returns to her spinning wheel, unwilling to let her hands remain idle even in the dim light. She works entirely by feel her fingers guiding the wool onto the spindle with practiced rhythmic motions. You sit on the floor nearby, taking up a torn wool stocking that requires mending. You thread a bone needle with coarse yarn, squinting in the poor light to find the edges of the hole. You push the needle through the thick fabric, feeling the resistance before it pops through to the other side. Muted conversation drifts between your parents, fragments of village news and practical concerns about the coming week. Your father mentions Thomas, the son of the prosperous farmer from the next village, noting his skill with the plow team. You keep your head bowed over your mending, hiding the sudden flush of heat that creeps up your neck. You know the betrothal negotiations are quietly underway, a transaction that will soon dictate the remainder of your life. You focus on pulling the yarn tight, creating a neat row of stitches across the frayed wool. You try to imagine living in a different cottage, serving a different hearth, but the thought remains abstract and frightening. You tie off the yarn and bite the end clean, smoothing the repaired fabric over your knee. The stocking is functional once more, saved from the rag pile for another season of wear. You place it in the wooden chest at the foot of the ladder, your movements slow and deliberate. The village outside is silent now, the dolls asleep in the blacksmith's hammer finally resting on its anvil. The darkness is absolute beyond the wooden shutters, a vast, imposing void that presses against the frail human settlements. You sit back by the fire, letting the radiant heat soak into your weary muscles as the evening stretches onward. Your mother stops the spinning wheel, the sudden lack of vibration noticeable in the small room. She gathers the spun thread, wrapping it carefully into a tight skein for storage. You watch her hands, noting the swollen joints and the deep cracks in the skin around her knuckles. You know your own hands will look exactly like hers in a few short decades, shaped by the same relentless labor. You stand and fetch a broom, sweeping the stray fibers and floor dust into the hearth to be consumed by the flames. You move through the shadows of the room, preparing the space for the eventual transition to the deepest part of the night. You hear the faint scuffling of mice in the thatch above, a common sound that rarely draws attention. The animals have sought refuge from the cold, sharing the warmth of the human habitation. Your father pulls a thick wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The rushlight gutters and dies, plunging the room into the ruddy, shifting gloom of the banked fire. You sit quietly, absorbing the profound stillness that settles over the cottage. The day's labor is finally complete, leaving only the unhurried endurance of the evening hours. You shift your weight on the hard dirt floor, seeking a more comfortable position near the fading hearth. The embers cast a dull, throbbing glow across the uneven stones, offering heat but very little illumination. Shadows stretched long and distorted against the wattle walls, turning familiar tools into strange, looming shapes. The draft from the ill-fitting door sweeps across your ankles, carrying the sharp scent of frozen earth. This is the quietest phase of the waking day, a narrow margin of time between the cessation of heavy labor and the ascent to the sleeping loft. Bitter drafts push against the thick timber framing of the cottage, a persistent force that tests the integrity of the thatched roof. Dust motes dance violently in the meager light, disturbed by the invisible currents moving through the room. A stray piece of dried mud falls from the ceiling landing with a soft thud near the edge of the fire pit. The structural groans of the house form a familiar nighttime chorus, the wood expanding and contracting in the bitter temperature. Survival here relies on the strength of these walls, a barrier erected against a landscape that offers no mercy to the exposed. You observe your father rise slowly from his bench, his joints popping loudly in the hushed space. He moves toward the heavy oak door, lifting the iron latch to step out into the freezing darkness. A blast of frigid air rushes inward instantly, biting at the exposed skin of your face and hands. The night sky reveals nothing, a solid wall of blackness pressing down upon the small village. He disappears into the gloom, tasked with the nightly chore of securing the livestock before the worst of the cold settles in. Footsteps return mere moments later, accompanied by the frantic clatter of hooves and the agitated clucking of poultry. Your father herds the small collection of animals over the threshold, guiding them toward the penned enclosure at the far end of the single room. The pig snorts loudly, its bulk brushing against your leg as it seeks the darkest corner of the straw-lined pen. The 3 chickens flutter to their low wooden roost, their feathers rustling sharply as they settle for the night. The goat hesitates at the door, requiring a firm nudge to cross into the smoky interior of the human dwelling. You rise from the hearth side to secure the wooden gate of the indoor pen, sliding the carved peg into its designated slot. The smell of the cottage changes immediately, the wood smoke overwhelmed by the heavy, pungent odor of wet wool and fresh manure. This shared arrangement guarantees the survival of the precious livestock, pooling the collective body heat of animals and humans within the thick wattle walls. You reach through the rough slats to scratch the goat behind the ears, feeling the coarse texture of its winter coat. The animal leans into your touch, a brief moment of connection, before it lowers its head to search the straw for dropped grain. Across the room, your mother begins the deliberate process of banking the fire for the long, unattended hours ahead. She uses an iron poker to push the brightest coals into a tight mound at the center of the hearthstone. She covers the glowing pile with a thick layer of fine gray ash, smothering the flames while preserving the essential heat. This task requires exact precision. Too much ash will extinguish the coals, while too little will allow the fire to consume itself before the dawn. You retrieve your second dress from the small wooden chest resting near the foot of the loft ladder. Tomorrow brings the Sabbath, the one day of the week requiring an appearance at the stone church in the center of the village. The fabric feels stiff and unyielding in your hands, the dark wool holding the faint scent of dried lavender and stale smoke. You lay the garment flat across the wooden table, running your palms over the material to smooth the deepest creases. The act of preparing the Sunday clothing serves as a strict boundary separating the endless toil of the week from the mandatory rest of the holy day. Stiff hog bristles form the brush resting on the shelf beside the clay bowls. You take the tool and begin to work it across the weave of the dress, lifting the embedded dust in small fragments of straw. The rhythmic scratching noise fills the quiet air, a steady cadence that demands no conscious thought. You focus your attention on the hem, where the mud from last Sunday's walk has dried into a pale, crusty line. The labor is meticulous and slow, ensuring you will stand before the priest with the proper level of modest respectability. You inspect your soft leather shoes by the dim light of the smothered hearth, finding the material stiff and cracked from the day's moisture. The soles are worn dangerously thin, a constant worry as the frozen ground shows no sign of yielding to spring. You take a small dab of rendered mutton fat from a clay jar, working the grease into the seams with your thumbs. The leather groans slightly under the pressure, slowly absorbing the fat and regaining a measure of flexibility. You set the treated shoes near the edge of the warm stones, allowing the residual heat to draw the oil deeper into the fiber. Absolute silence reclaims the cottage as the final preparations conclude, a heavy, thick quiet that presses against your ears. Your brother is already resting in the corner, his breathing slow and even under a pile of rough woolen blankets. The pig lets out a long, shuddering sigh from the pen shifting its bulk in the dry straw. The world has contracted entirely to the space within these four walls. A tiny island of warmth suspended in an ocean of freezing black. You understand the vulnerability of this existence, knowing a single stray spark or a sudden illness could destroy this fragile equilibrium in a matter of hours. You reach for the water bucket to take a final drink, finding a thin layer of ice already forming across the surface. You break the crystalline shell with your knuckles, the sudden cold shocking your skin. You scoop a small amount into the clay cup, tasting the sharp metallic bite of the well water mixed with the faint flavor of the wooden staves. The chill travels down your throat, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth trapped near the ceiling of the cottage. You place the cup back on the shelf, your movements deliberate to avoid disturbing the quiet room. Your father climbs the steep wooden ladder to the sleeping loft, the rungs creaking loudly under his heavy tread. The overhead floorboards groan as he settles his weight, a shower of fine dust drifting down from the exposed beams. Your mother remains by the hearth for another moment, making one final assessment of the ash-covered mound. She touches your shoulder briefly as she passes, a silent dismissal that marks the official end of your required duties. You watch her ascend into the darkness of the loft, leaving you alone with the glowing embers and the restless animals. You kneel by the edge of the hearthstone, spreading your hands wide to catch the last radiating warmth. The stone is hot enough to burn, a solid mass of heat that will keep the cottage from freezing before the sun returns. You stare at the tiny fissures in the gray ash, watching the angry red light pulse beneath the surface. The hypnotic glow pulls at your exhausted mind, dragging your thoughts toward the edge of fatigue. You force your eyes open, knowing you must bank the final perimeter before abandoning the main floor. Beyond the walls, the village of Domrémy rests under the crushing weight of the medieval night. No lamps burn in the neighboring cottages, no voices travel across the hardened lanes. The darkness enforces a mandatory stillness, suspending the endless cycle of labor until the bells ring once more. You know the blacksmith is resting, his massive arms recovering after 12 hours at the forge. You know goodwife Emma is likely waking to nurse her infant, sitting in the same darkness that surrounds you now. You gather the stray sweeping of straw from the floor, tossing them into the pen to add to the animal bedding. The goat blinks at you, its horizontal pupils catching the faintest glimmer of the berry fire. You check the wooden latch on the heavy front door, one last time, assuring yourself the iron bolt is thrown securely. The barrier feels fragile against the vastness of the night, yet it is the only defense you possess against the harsh elements. You turn away from the door, the final core completed. Worn wooden rungs await you in the shadows, polished by generations of ascending and descending feet. The air grows noticeably warmer as you climb, the rising heat of the fire trapped beneath the sloped thatch of the roof. The sleeping loft is cramped and low, forcing you to stoop to avoid striking your head on the rough timber beams. You navigate the narrow space by memory, avoiding the spot where the floorboards are known to splinter. The smell of unwashed bodies and old wool is strong here, a comforting testament to the survival of your family. You find your narrow space on the straw mattress, carefully peeling back the heavy, scratchy blanket. The loft holds the collective breathing of your parents, a steady, rhythmic sound that anchors you in the dark. You keep your underdress on, the standard practice for fighting off the bitter cold of the upper chamber. You slide beneath the covers, the rough wool immediately biting into the tender skin of your arms and neck. The mattress crunches loudly beneath your weight, the dried stalks of straw shifting to accommodate your tired body. Time loses its rigid structure in the depths of the night, stretching into an ambiguous void of cold and quiet. You lie awake for a long while, listening to the wind seek out the vulnerabilities in the thatched roof above. The muscles in your back continue to twitch, phantom echoes of the hoe striking the frozen earth of the garden plot. You trace the shape of the rafters with your eyes, though the darkness renders them completely invisible. The deep bronze voice of the church bell remains silent, holding its summons for the dawn that feels impossibly far away. You fold your hands across your chest, seeking to preserve the meager heat generated by your own body. The scratch of the wool dress against your collarbone is a constant, minor irritation that you have learned to ignore. You think about the Sunday Mass approaching, the Latin words that will wash over you without yielding their meaning. The structure of your existence is rigid, defined by the seasons, the church, and the endless demands of the soil. You do not question this boundary, for you possess no language to imagine a life lived outside its borders. Downstairs, the pig shifts against the water wall, the heavy thud vibrating up through the floorboards. The domestic animals are as much a part of this household as the people, their survival inextricably linked to your own. You know the manure accumulating in the pen will fertilize the spring crops, creating a closed circle of life and labor. The harshness of this reality is absolute, devoid of the romance woven into the songs of traveling minstrels. You accept the cold, the smell, and the exhaustion as the fundamental conditions of your being. You turn onto your side, pulling your knees up to conserve the warmth pooling in the center of the bed. The cold seeps through the cracks in the wooden gables, carrying the sharp scent of an approaching snow squall. You bury your face in the rough fabric of the blanket, breathing in the familiar odors of smoke, sweat, and dried lavender. Your mind remains stubbornly alert, reviewing the inventory of dried peas and the condition of the spinning wheel. The deep medieval night claims the village, but you must simply endure the long dark hours in wakeful stillness. Frost thickens as the hours drag forward, a physical weight that presses down on the thatched roof. You track the progress of the night by the subtle shifts in temperature and the changing groans of the timber framing. The fire below must be holding its own, for the chill in the loft remains manageable, though far from comfortable. You listen for the distant sound of the watchman, though your small village rarely warrants such formal patrols. The isolation of the settlement feels absolute, a lone island of humanity surrounded by vast, unforgiving forests and frozen fields. You adjust your legs to alleviate a cramped building in your calf, the sudden movement loud in the silent space. The rough straw pokes through the thin linen of the mattress, ticking, scratching against your bare ankles. You focus on the steady rhythm of your father's breathing, a sound that has meant safety since your earliest memories. The knowledge of the impending betrothal hangs over you, a looming reality that will eventually strip away this familiar sanctuary. You push the thought away, choosing instead to concentrate on the immediate sensations of the dark room. By the deepest point of the night, the wind dies down, leaving a silence so profound it rings in your ears. You stare into the blackness, your eyes adjusting to see the faint, ghostly outlines of the roof beams. The tension in your shoulders slowly unknots, the physical stress of the hoe and the spinning wheel bleeding away into the mattress. The discipline of the day gives way to the necessary stillness of the dark, a time meant solely for physical recovery. You lie in the narrow bed, breathing in the cold air, existing perfectly within the unyielding parameters of your era. You listen to the relentless gale battering the frozen exterior of the cottage walls. The heavy timber frame groans under the invisible pressure, shifting marginally against the packed earth foundation. Cold air forces its way through the microscopic gaps in the dried daw, bringing the sharp scent of a coming snowstorm into the confined space. The thatched roof above your head rustles endlessly, sounding like a massive, agitated beast settling in for the night. You pull the rough wool blanket higher over your ears, attempting to block out the harsh noise of the elements. The winter refuses to yield its grip on the landscape, demanding endurance from every living creature trapped beneath its frozen expanse. Beyond the fragile shelter of your home, the village of Domrémy remains locked in unyielding blackness. No moon pierces the thick layer of clouds, leaving the ruts and frozen mud of the lanes rendered invisible to the human eye. The bare branches of the great elm near the well scrape harshly against one another, tossing their broken twigs onto the hardened ground below. The stone walls of the church stand as a solid, immovable mass against the surging wind, offering no light or comfort to the surrounding wattled structures. Even the dogs have ceased their restless barking, choosing to huddle far within their straw-lined shelters. The cold is a physical entity out there, stripping the heat from anything foolish enough to wander away from a hearth. You turn your head cautiously on the coarse straw mattress, wincing as the dry stalks crunch loudly in the stillness. The friction of the woven linen ticking creates a sudden bright static that crackles against your ear. You seek a new pocket of warmth, curling your body into a tight coil to trap the heat radiating from your own skin. The air resting just inches above your nose feels icy, a sharp contrast to the stifling conditions of the main room earlier in the evening. You force your muscles to relax, unclenching your jaw and letting your shoulders drop away from your neck. The physical toll of the garden work continues to echo through your bones, a dull throbbing that demands the repair of undisturbed rest. Wood smoke lingers heavily in the loft, a permanent feature of the atmosphere that coats the rafters and your clothing alike. The scent carries the metallic tang of the ash banked over the coals down below, mixed with the resinous odor of the oak logs. It provides a strange sort of comfort, a constant reminder that the fire survives and will eventually bring light back to the dwelling. A stray draft catches a flake of soot from the chimney stones, sending it drifting blindly through the dark to land on the edge of your blanket. The smell of the confined animals also rises from the lower floor, the pungent musk of wet goat hair and the earthy odor of the pig. These smells form the invisible architecture of your world, defining the boundaries of safety against the hostile exterior. You trace the shape of the nearest roof beam with your mind, though your eyes can perceive nothing but solid black. The heavy timber was cut from the surrounding forest years before your birth, shaped by the swing of an iron adze and hoisted into place by the collective strength of your neighbors. You know every knot and split in the wood, having stared at them during countless winter nights. The structure provides a tangible connection to the past, a physical manifestation of the labor required to carve a life from the unforgiving terrain. You run your fingers over the edge of the wooden bed frame, feeling the uneven grain and the small splinters that have snagged your dresses over the years. The cottage is an extension of your family, bearing the scars of weather and time just as heavily as the people who inhabit it. Down the lane, old Marjorie the midwife likely rests with one ear tuned to the howling wind, knowing the weather often forces premature labor upon the women of the settlement. Her cottage holds bundles of specialized herbs, dried carefully to halt hemorrhages or hasten a difficult delivery when the moment arrives. She exists in a state of perpetual readiness. Her age offers no excuse when a neighbor beats frantically upon her door in the darkest hours. Her hands possess the accumulated knowledge of countless births, the grim reality of bringing fragile life into a brutal environment. The village relies upon her skill to navigate the most dangerous threshold a woman will face, offering grain and cheese in desperate exchange for her presence. Her authority rivals that of the priest when the screams begin, her pragmatic commands cutting through the panic of a terrifying night. You imagine the heavy iron key turning in the lock of the church door, an action Father Cuthbert performed hours ago. The sacred space stands empty now, the painted saints on the frescoed walls staring blindly into the pitch black of the nave. The wooden rood screen separates the altar from the common standing area, a carved boundary that divides the holy from the profane. You try to picture the fading red and gold of the crucifix hanging above it, the stylized agony meant to inspire devotion and fear in equal measure. The Latin words of the Mass float through your memory, disconnected syllables that carry the weight of mystery without the clarity of understanding. You cross yourself beneath the heavy blanket, a small, automatic gesture of faith performed in the isolating darkness. Midnight passes without fanfare, marked only by the shifting constellations hidden far behind the cloud cover. The temperature drops another degree, freezing the surface of the well water solid and turning the mud of the lane into treacherous ridges of ice. The wood of the cottage framing contracts with a sharp crack sounding like a breaking bone in the hush of the loft. The sound startles a mouse hiding in the thatch, sending it scurrying frantically across the dried reeds above your face. The frantic scratching fades as the tiny creature finds a deeper crevice, returning the space to the overwhelming silence of the freeze. The world is locked in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the rotation of the earth to eventually bring the distant sun. You shift your legs downward, pushing the heavy wool covers toward your ankles to relieve the oppressive weight. The sudden exposure shocks your skin, sending a violent shiver rippling up your spine and into your shoulders. You immediately pull the fabric back into place, regretting the attempt to find comfort in the freezing air. The cold is a predator that exploits any vulnerability, punishing the smallest mistake with a relentless bite. You tuck the edges of the blanket firmly under the straw mattress, sealing the cocoon of warmth against the invasive drafts. You press your hands between your thighs, utilizing the heat of your core to thaw your stiffening fingers. Beside the silent forge, the blacksmith's massive anvil rests cold and inert, stripped of the roaring heat that defines its daytime existence. The heavy hammers lie scattered across the dirt floor, trapped in exhaustion when the fading light made the work impossible. The bellows remain collapsed, their leather lungs empty of the wind required to melt the stubborn iron. Only a faint smell of sulfur and scorched metal lingers in the open-sided shed, a ghost of the frantic activity that dominates the daylight hours. The village depends upon the repair of plows and the forging of tools, tethering their agricultural survival to the strength of the smith's arm. The darkness grants him a temporary reprieve, allowing his battered muscles to recover before the anvil demands his labor once more. You reach a hand upward, letting your knuckles brush against the rough thatch extending over the edge of the bed. The dried reeds are brittle and sharp, breaking off in tiny fragments that fall onto your hair. You can feel the intense cold radiating from the roof, a solid block of freezing air pressing down upon the loft. The barrier between your fragile human warmth and the lethal winter storm is terrifyingly thin. Nothing more than a layer of dried grass and woven sticks. You withdraw your hand, quickly returning it to the safety of the heavy woolen covers. You marvel at the precarious nature of your survival, aware that a single stray ember or a collapsing beam could end your existence in minutes. A mile away, in a slightly larger cottage, the Fletcher's daughter Margaret likely stares into the same unyielding darkness. Her recent betrothal to William has shifted her future from the familiar comfort of her childhood home to the daunting prospect of a stranger's hearth. She must navigate the expectations of a new mother-in-law, the demands of a notoriously quarrelsome husband, and the physical reality of the marriage bed. The formal negotiations between the fathers stripped her of any voice in the matter, reducing her life to a contract involving dowries and land rights. Her silent tears in the church provided the only outlet for her terror, a public display of private despair that the village noted and dismissed as normal nerves. The night offers her no solace, only the endless hours to contemplate the terrifying transition awaiting her. You close your eyes tightly, forcing your mind away from the harrowing reality of Margaret's impending marriage. The thought of your own inevitable betrothal causes a sudden tightening in your chest, a knot of anxiety that makes it difficult to draw a full breath. You know your father will eventually negotiate your future, trading your labor and your fertility to another family in exchange for standing or security. You will leave the mother who taught you the names of the herbs and the rhythms of the spinning wheel, trading her guidance for the absolute authority of a husband. You swallow hard against the fear, recognizing the futility of resisting the established order of your world. You command your breathing to return to an even pace, burying the terror far within the practical necessities of the moment. High on the ridge overlooking the village, the Lord's manor house stands as a monument to wealth and impenetrable power. The massive stone walls reject the wind, offering a level of security wholly alien to the fragile wattle cottages below. The Lord's granaries hold the excess wheat harvested by the sweat of your father's brow, a surplus gathered through the mandatory labor services dictated by feudal law. Armed guards walk the perimeter, their iron-shod boots ringing sharply against the frozen cobblestones of the courtyard. The inhabitants of the manor sleep on feather mattresses, insulated from the biting cold by heavy tapestries and roaring fireplaces. The vast disparity in existence is simply accepted as the natural order of the universe, ordained by God and enforced by the threat of violence. You press your face against the rough linen of the pillow, the fabric smelling of dried sweat and old straw. The rhythmic breathing of your parents continues unbroken, a constant metronome marking the relentless passage of the dark hours. You understand their exhaustion is absolute, a bone-deep weariness that requires every available second of rest to combat. They carry the immense burden of keeping the household fed and sheltered, a responsibility that leaves no room for hesitation or weakness. You know your own labor contributes to this precarious balance. Your sore hands, a necessary component of the family's survival strategy. You vow silently to work harder in the coming day, to pull your share of the weight without complaint. A sudden sharp crack from the frozen lane shatters the stillness, sounding like a heavy branch snapping under the weight of accumulated ice. The noise reverberates through the valley, briefly masking the continuous howl of the winter wind. You tense your muscles, waiting for a follow-up sound, a shout, or the thud of approaching footsteps. The village remains hushed, the darkness absorbing the interruption and returning the landscape to its isolated slumber. The sudden surge of adrenaline leaves your heart pounding against your ribs, a frantic drumming in the hollow of your chest. You wait until the rhythm slows, recognizing the jumpiness as a symptom of the deep, isolating night. You bring your knees closer to your chin, forming the smallest possible shape beneath the heavy blankets. The physical confinement of the narrow bed mirrors the restrictive boundaries of your life, a space where every movement is dictated by necessity rather than choice. You cannot wander the roads like the traveling merchants, discovering the distant towns and the strange, brackish scent of the sea. You cannot retreat to the intellectual sanctuary of a monastery, exchanging your physical labor for the ability to decipher the Latin text of a sacred book. Your existence is tied to this specific patch of earthbound by the ironclad rules of gender, class, and the feudal system. You accept these limitations without resentment, for the concept of individual freedom does not exist within your vocabulary. Below you, the spinning wheel stands dormant in the shadows of the main room, its flyer motionless and its treadle resting against the floor. The unfinished bobbin of thread waits for the return of the sun, a tangible demand for your continuous labor. The machine requires constant interaction, demanding hours of repetitive motion to produce the material necessary for winter clothing. The simple wooden construction represents the technological pinnacle of your domestic world, a tool refined over generations to maximize the efficiency of a woman's hands. The wood is polished by the oils of your skin, a physical record of the countless hours you have spent chained to its rhythm. The wheel will be waiting when the dawn finally breaks, a relentless master that accepts no excuses for idleness. You feel the unmistakable sensation of a flea moving across your ankle, a tiny, irritating itch that demands immediate attention. You reach down blindly, pinching the rough fabric of the underdress in an attempt to crush the parasite against your skin. The insect escapes your grasp, retreating into the impenetrable maze of the wool blanket. You rub the irritated spot vigorously, the friction providing a temporary relief from the sharp biting sensation. Vermin are an inescapable reality of the medieval household, sharing the warmth of the fire and the shelter of the thatch. You learn to ignore the constant crawling, incorporating the minor discomforts into the baseline of your daily existence. The wind shifts direction, slamming against the southern face of the cottage with renewed intensity. The entire structure shudders, a deep resonant vibration that travels up the ladder and into the planks of the loft. The dried daub crumbles marginally around the edges of the shuttered window downstairs, allowing a fine dusting of snow to infiltrate the main room. The elements constantly probe the defenses of the village, searching for a weakness to exploit, a gap to force their way inside. The battle against the cold is waged every single day, requiring constant vigilance and the endless gathering of firewood. The frozen night is the enemy, a hostile force that must be endured until the spring finally forces a retreat. You let out a measured breath, watching the faint white plume materialize and vanish in the freezing air. The night seems to stretch into eternity, an unbroken expanse of blackness that tests the limits of your patience. You try to calculate the hours remaining until the church bell signals the start of the morning routine, but the lack of visual cues makes the estimation impossible. You must simply wait, suspended in the dark, trusting that the rotation of the earth will eventually bring the pale light of dawn. You focus on the rhythmic beating of your own heart, a reliable sound that proves you have survived another hour of the bitter freeze. You lie perfectly still, conserving your energy for the grueling tasks that await you in the coming day. You listen to the rhythmic scratching of a wood-boring beetle somewhere in the massive oak beam above your head. The tiny sound amplifies in the profound stillness of the darkest watch, a persistent scraping that ignores the freezing temperature. You trace the noise back and forth, imagining the microscopic jaws working through the ancient timber holding the thatch in place. Your body remains rigidly locked beneath the heavy woolen blankets, unwilling to surrender even a fraction of hard-won heat to the drafts. The cold air pressing against your exposed face carries a new texture, a heavy dampness that promises a thick snowfall before the dawn finally breaks. You focus on the slow, measured drawing of breath into your lungs, a deliberate exercise to keep the anxiety of the isolated night at bay. Drafts of icy air snake through the invisible gaps in the thatched roof, invisible serpents sliding over the woven linen of the mattress ticking. The temperature has plummeted to a lethal degree, transforming the small cottage into a precarious island of survival amid a frozen sea. Moisture from your breath freezes almost instantly upon the rough fibers of the blanket pulled tightly near your chin. The timber frame of the structure groans under the shifting barometric pressure, a deep wooden complaint against the harshness of the medieval season. Silence rushes back in after every creak, a heavy, suffocating blanket that isolates the dwelling from the rest of the sleeping village. You visualize the bundle of dried yarrow hanging from the rafters downstairs, suspended in the smoky darkness near the banked hearth. Your mother gathered those white flowers during the high heat of late summer, anticipating the fevers and deep cuts of the brutal winter months. You remember the sharp, medicinal scent of the crushed leaves, a smell that signifies healing and quiet female authority in your small community. The knowledge of these plants forms a silent currency among the village women, passed from grandmothers to daughters in hushed conversations away from the men. You pull the rough wool tighter around your shoulders, wondering when you will be trusted with the deeper secrets of the remedies. Outside in the frozen lane, the rutted mud is hardened into treacherous ridges of stone-like earth. The communal well sits locked in a carapace of ice, the heavy hemp rope frozen solid against the wooden windlass. No traveler dares the roads in this depth of the night, leaving the settlement cut off from the distant towns and the broader kingdom of France. The vast, menacing forest pressing against the edges of the fields hides wolves and desperate men, threats kept at bay only by the fragile wattle fences. The isolation of Domrémy is absolute during these black hours, a stark reminder of humanity's smallness against the vast canvas of the winter elements. You contemplate the tales your father tells by the firelight, stories of great storms and communal struggle that bind the neighbors together in hardship. The narrative of the lightning striking the church tower remains a vivid picture in your mind, a testament to the village acting as a single, living organism. You visualize the bucket line stretching from the well to the smoking roofmen and women passing water in a desperate bid to save the stone sanctuary. The shared labor creates a permanent bond, a mutual reliance that ensures no family starves entirely alone when the autumn harvest fails. You shift your weight cautiously, finding a sliver of comfort in the knowledge that your survival is tethered to the strength of your local community. By the third watch of the night, the physical ache in your lower back subsides into a dull, manageable throb. The intense labor of the garden plot feels distant now, replaced by the immediate necessity of simply staying warm in the unheated loft. The darkness strips away the immediate demands of the spinning wheel and the carding paddles, offering a rare sanctuary for unguided thought. The mind wanders freely through the confines of the frozen era, unburdened by the constant physical tasks required to maintain the peasant household. This suspended state between wakefulness and the elusive promise of rest stretches outward, a boundless expanse of quiet, motionless contemplation. You remember the whispers exchanged near the church steps regarding the traveling merchant and his news of distant, violent conflicts. The disputes between foreign kings and powerful nobles mean little to your daily routine, translating only into the occasional demand for increased taxes or forced labor. You try to imagine the sprawling cities and towering cathedrals the traveler described, but your mental canvas is limited to the familiar stone of your local parish. The world beyond the valley of the Meuse River remains an abstract concept, a collection of dangerous rumors and impossible wealth that holds no place in your life. You press your cold hands against your ribs, satisfied with the predictable, contained reality of your own narrow existence. Ancient iron forms the sickle resting near the hearth downstairs, representing the endless cycle of agricultural obligation binding your family to the soil. The lord of the manor claims a portion of every harvest, a toll extracted in exchange for the right to work the narrow strips of land. The fuel system operates with ruthless efficiency, ensuring the surplus grain flows upward to the stone fortress overlooking the settlement. The sharp curve of the blade dictates the rhythm of the autumn months, demanding back-breaking labor until the final sheaf is bound and delivered. The tool waits in the darkness, a silent promise of the grueling physical exertion that the coming spring will demand from your aging father. You ponder the convent girls, the daughters given away to the cloistered stone walls to live out their days as brides of Christ. The concept feels incredibly foreign, an existence devoid of the muddy fields, the spinning wheels, and the terrifying prospect of childbirth. You imagine them waking in the freezing dark to chant Latin prayers, their voices rising in unison while the rest of the secular world slumbers. The sacrifice of their freedom buys them access to the mysterious written word, the ability to decode the ink marks covering the precious vellum manuscripts. You rub your tired eyes, wondering if the endless silence of the nunnery is truly preferable to the loud, messy reality of the village lane. Smells of dried dust and old straw rise from the mattress, ticking with every subtle adjustment of your posture in the dark. The familiar odor grounds you in the immediate present, dispelling the wandering thoughts of distant convents and foreign wars. A faint hint of dried lavender struggles against the overpowering scent of the penned animals. Below a small floral victory in the confined space of the cottage, the olfactory landscape of the dwelling is complex and unchanging, a signature mixture of wood smoke, livestock, and unwashed wool garments. The air feels heavy and stagnant in the loft trapped beneath the sloping thatch until the morning draft finally sweeps through the open door. You envision the pale cream linen of the dowry cloth your mother weaves with such painstaking care and measured patience. The subtle sheen of the fabric represents years of accumulated skill, a tangible investment in a future that remains frustratingly vague and uncertain. You know, the cloth will eventually form a wedding dress marking the irrevocable transition from your father's house to the strict authority of a husband. The delicate trim of embroidery planned for the neckline is a rare luxury, a fierce declaration of your family's modest pride and hard-won standing in the village. You clench your jaw, pushing back the familiar wave of anxiety that always accompanies thoughts of the impending marital negotiations. Beneath the floorboards, the family pig lets out a long, rumbling snort, shifting its massive bulk in the dried bracken of the indoor pen. The sudden noise shatters the delicate quiet of the loft, pulling your attention back to the immediate reality of the shared dwelling. The animals provide a crucial layer of ambient heat, their bodies acting as living furnaces that keep the bitter frost from fully claiming the interior. The smell of fresh manure rises through the cracks in the wood, an earthy reminder of the necessary proximity between human and beast during the winter months. The domestic creatures are tethered to the same unforgiving cycle of survival, their lives dictated by the measured distribution of scarce winter fodder. You extend a tentative hand beyond the edge of the blanket, immediately regretting the exposure to the frigid air of the room. The temperature has reached its absolute nadir, the point in the night where the blood moves sluggishly and the breath turns to ice. You withdraw your fingers quickly, burying them deep within the folds of the scratchy woolen fabric before the cold takes hold. The necessity of enduring this brutal chill is woven into your bones, a stoic acceptance passed down through generations of peasants facing the same relentless winters. You close your eyes and focus on generating internal heat, utilizing every ounce of energy derived from the evening pottage to keep the freezing air at bay. Hours stretch into a formless void, stripping away any concept of measured time or predictable schedule in the windowless loft. The darkness acts as a sensory deprivation chamber, amplifying the smallest noises and intensifying the chills seeping through the water walls. The mind attempts to construct a timeline based on the shifting creaks of the timber, a futile exercise in an environment devoid of visual markers or chiming bells. The relentless waiting becomes a physical burden, a test of mental endurance that matches the physical strain of the daily chores required for survival. The frozen night demands absolute submission, punishing impatience with a heightened awareness of the biting temperature pressing against the roof. You detect the subtle change in the rhythmic breathing coming from your parents' side of the narrow sleeping platform. Your father's respiration hitches, breaking the steady cadence before settling into a deeper, more resonant snore that fills the space. The sound is comforting, a sign of profound exhaustion, giving way to the restorative depths of heavy, healing slumber. You envy his ability to disconnect from the biting cold, to surrender entirely to the necessary repair of his battered muscles. You mimic his slow inhalations, attempting to trick your own body into slipping across the threshold of wakefulness. But the persistent chill keeps your senses sharply tuned to the environment. Flat wooden carding paddles rest idle on the lower floor, their fine wire teeth clear of the oily sheep fleece they comb during the day. The tools represent hours of agonizing cramps in the hands, a repetitive scraping motion that leaves the palms blistered and incredibly sore. The finished rolls of wool stacked beside the hearth are the silent testament to your endurance, the raw material necessary to clothe the family against the elements. The paddles wait with an eerie patience, demanding to be taken up again the moment the sun provides sufficient light for the tedious work. The cycle of labor never truly halts, merely pausing for the brief, dark hours of the medieval night. You reflect on the village midwife, Goodwife Marjorie, and the mysterious power she wields within the small, tight-knit community. Her hands hold the secrets of life and death, navigating the terrifying threshold of childbirth with calm, pragmatic authority that rivals the local priest. You remember overhearing the hushed conversations regarding her herbal mixtures, the specific plants required to halt bleeding or hasten a difficult delivery. The knowledge feels dangerous and essential, a hidden curriculum passed exclusively through the female lineage of the isolated settlement. You wonder if you possess the steady nerves required to perform such grim, vital work when your own time eventually comes to face the birthing stool. Sharp metallic tastes linger in the back of your throat, a remnant of the freezing well water consumed hours ago before retiring to the loft. The flavor of iron and whetstone is a constant companion, distinct from the flat, bitter profile of the weak daytime ale served with meals. A sudden hunger pang twists in your stomach, demanding sustenance that will not be available until the morning pottage is reheated over the flames. The sensation is easily ignored, a minor discomfort compared to the pressing need to preserve body heat in the freezing elevation of the bed. The physical realities of your existence are managed through strict discipline of forced stoicism that ensures survival in a landscape defined by scarcity. You picture the great mill sitting silent beside the frozen river, its massive wooden wheel locked in a sheath of rigid, unyielding ice. The relentless grinding of the heavy stones has ceased, granting the village a rare reprieve from the low, vibrating hum that defines the daylight hours. The miller and his boys rest in their own dwelling, their lungs momentarily free from the choking white dust of the milled grain. You understand the profound importance of that structure, the mechanical heart that transforms the raw harvest into the flour necessary to bake the communal bread. You shift your legs slightly, respecting the absolute stillness that claims even the most powerful machinery of the medieval settlement. Deep within the surrounding forest, the ancient oaks stand rigid against the surging winter wind that sweeps down through the valley. The skeletal branches scrape together with the sound of grinding bone, dropping shattered twigs onto the frozen snowpack covering the forest floor. Wild creatures huddle in their deep burrows, fighting the same desperate battle for warmth that occupies the human inhabitants of the wooden cottages. The untamed wilderness represents a constant threat, a dark expanse hiding predators and desperate outlaws who operate outside the bounds of the Lord's justice. The fragile wattle fences of the village offer a psychological barrier more than a physical one, marking the meager territory successfully claimed by civilization. You focus on the texture of the linen head covering resting on the wooden chest at the foot of the steep loft ladder. The simple fabric marks your status as a respectable girl, a modest requirement enforced by both the church and the watchful eyes of the village matrons. You know the meticulous care required to keep the linen clean, the endless scrubbing and freezing water to remove the stains of the hearth and the muddy field. The garment is the symbol of your transition toward womanhood, a visible indicator of your compliance with the rigid social structures of your strict era. You pull the blanket up to your chin, accepting the weight of those societal expectations without question or thought of rebellion. Sounds of the timber frame contracting echo through the loft again, sharp cracks that rival the noise of a splitting log thrown upon a massive fire. The extreme temperature drop exerts immense pressure on the wooden pegs holding the structure together, testing the craftsmanship of the men who built the dwelling. The constant groaning creates a strange, lullaby, rhythmic reminder of the physical forces acting upon the fragile shelter constructed by human hands. The noise is preferable to the utter silence, proving that the cottage remains intact against the battering ram of the winter gale. The structural symphony continues unabated, a harsh music that accompanies the long, wakeful hours of the deep night. You summon the taste of the sharp cheese shared during the midday meal, the salty fat providing a sudden burst of vital energy when you needed it most. The careful rationing of such luxuries dictates the survival of the household, ensuring the stores remain viable until the spring thaw finally releases the earth. You understand the complex calculations your mother performs daily, balancing the immediate hunger of the family against the terrifying prospect of an empty larder in late March. The discipline required to stop eating before the stomach is completely full is a lesson learned early and reinforced by the harsh realities of the peasant class. You press a hand against your abdomen, acknowledging the low ache of hunger as a familiar, unthreatening companion in the dark. Toward the absolute midpoint of the watch, the wind abruptly ceases, leaving a vacuum of sound that rings unpleasantly in the ears. The sudden quiet is startling, pulling your senses into a heightened state of alert as you strain to identify any approaching danger hidden in the gloom. The absence of the howling gale allows the smaller noises of the cottage to emerge clearly, the scuffling of a mouse and the deep breathing of the livestock. The stillness feels heavy and pregnant, a temporary pause in the hostilities between the brutal weather and the fragile human settlement. The frozen landscape rests in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the next assault from the unpredictable and violent winter skies. You analyze the rough, unyielding texture of the straw mattress pressing relentlessly against your ribs and narrow shoulders. The dried stalks provide minimal cushioning, forcing your body to adapt to the uneven surface of the rigid wooden bed frame beneath the ticking. You know the process of replacing the filling, the dusty, exhausting labor of gathering fresh straw after the long autumn harvest concludes. The bed is a purely functional object designed to elevate the sleeper above the freezing drafts of the floor rather than provide any luxurious comfort. You adjust your posture to relieve a sharp pressure point on your hip, finding a marginal improvement in the sparse and unforgiving bedding. Heavy iron cooking pots hang suspended over the banked coals, their blackened exteriors encrusted with the thick soot of 1,000 daily fires. The vessel represents the sustaining core of the family, the magical cauldron that transforms hard grains and dried roots into life-saving pottage. The iron is a valuable inheritance, a sturdy tool that outlasts generations of the hard-working women who stir its simmering contents. The scent of onions and barley is permanently baked into the porous metal, a savory ghost that haunts the hearth even when the pot sits entirely empty. The silent iron waits in the darkness, ready to resume its critical function the moment the fire is stoked at the first light of dawn. You map out the muddy, rutted lane that connects the scattered cottages of Domrémy, visualizing the vital artery of the small community. The frozen mud captures the footprints of the villagers, preserving a chaotic record of the daily labor and the constant movement between the well and the fields. You envision the heavy cartwheels of the miller digging deep trenches into the earth scars that will remain until the spring rains eventually wash them away. The road is the stage upon which the social life of the settlement plays out, the location of hushed gossip and quick, practical exchanges of goods. You understand your own place upon that stage, a young woman navigating the complex web of obligations and expectations laid out before you. Above the thatched roof, the heavy cloud cover finally breaks for a fleeting moment, allowing a solitary star to pierce the absolute blackness. The tiny point of light offers no illumination to the frozen ground below, existing purely as a distant, indifferent observer of the suffering landscape. The sheer scale of the night sky diminishes the struggles of the village, rendering the human battles against cold and hunger insignificant against the vast cosmic canvas. The vastness of the heavens reinforces the strict teachings of the Church, demanding humility and total submission to the unknowable divine will. The isolated star burns with cold precision, a silent witness to the enduring resilience of the sleeping peasants huddled in their beds. You suffer a sudden, sharp cramp seizing the muscles of your left foot, a violent contraction brought on by the intense cold and the day's heavy exertion. You bite down hard on your lower lip to prevent a gasp from escaping. Unwilling to break the restorative sleep of your exhausted parents nearby, you reach down beneath the heavy blanket, using your stiff fingers to forcefully massage the knotted muscle until the spasm slowly releases its agonizing grip. The pain leaves a residual ache in its wake, a throbbing reminder of the severe physical toll extracted by the relentless cycle of daily labor. You stretch your leg cautiously, ensuring the muscle remains elongated to prevent a recurrence of the knot as you wait for the morning to arrive. Snow begins to fall sometime during the deepest hour of the watch, announcing its arrival with a delicate hiss against the frozen thatch. The sharp howling of the wind fades into a muffled rush, suppressed by the heavy curtain of white descending upon the valley. The cottage groans, adjusting to the sudden accumulation of weight on the sloped roof, the oak beams settling deeper into the earth foundation. The temperature inside the loft changes subtly, trading the piercing dry chill for a dense, encompassing dampness that clings to the woolen blankets. The village of Domrémy vanishes beneath the blizzard, every wattle fence and rutted lane erased by the relentless winter storm. You trace the invisible line of the central ridgepole with your eyes, listening to the steady accumulation of ice and snow overhead. The physical reality of the storm requires immediate mental calculation regarding the morning chores and the necessary path to the well. The woodpile sits outside the heavy timber door, demanding a treacherous walk through the drifts to secure fuel for the day. You know the animals will require extra fodder to maintain their internal heat, depleting the carefully guarded stores held in the woven baskets. The burden of winter survival multiplies with every passing hour of the snowfall, adding harsh variables to an already grueling existence. You shift your weight to alleviate the pressure on your left hip, seeking a softer patch of straw beneath the coarse linen ticking. The movement creates a loud rustle in the hushed space, drawing a sleep-heavy sigh from your father on the opposite side of the narrow platform. He turns away from the sound, pulling his thick sheepskin cloak tighter across his chest to ward off the invasive dampness. You hold your breath until his regular sonorous snoring resumes, unwilling to interrupt the crucial physical recovery he requires for the coming day. The men of the village face brutal labor regardless of the weather, tasked with clearing paths and repairing the damage inflicted by the heavy snow. Downstairs, the banked hearth emits a low, rhythmic popping sound as a pocket of sap bursts within the buried oak log. The noise provides a tiny anchor of comfort in the dark, a promise that the vital heat source remains alive beneath its coating of gray ash. The iron cooking pot hangs suspended over the embers, smelling faintly of old fat and the sharp tang of dried onions. The domestic space waits in suspended animation, a collection of essential tools resting idle until the sun dictates the resumption of work. The spinning wheels and carding paddles stand like silent sentinels in the shadows, marking the boundaries of the female domain. You listen to the nervous bleating of the goat rising from the indoor pen, the animal sensing the shift in the barometric pressure. The pig answers with a low, rumbling snort, pushing forcefully in the dried bracken to construct a warmer nest against the wattle wall. The proximity of the livestock generates a distinct earthy odor that rises through the floorboards, mixing with the pervasive smell of wood smoke and old wool. You understand their agitation, sharing the same primal instinct to seek shelter and huddle close when the elements turn hostile. The shared vulnerability binds human and beast together in a mutual pact of endurance reliant upon the strength of the timber frame. You flex your stiff fingers beneath the heavy blanket, working the joints to prevent the agonizing cramps from returning to your hands. The memory of the carding paddles leaves phantom aches across your palms, a physical echo of the repetitive scraping required to prepare the raw fleece. The wool must be uniform and clean before it touches the spinning wheel, demanding hours of meticulous attention from the women of the household. You envision the satisfying weight of the finished rolls stacked near the hearth, a tangible measure of your contribution to the family's winter wardrobe. The labor is endless and exacting, shaping your muscles and callousing your skin long before you reach your full growth. Hours bleed together in the windowless loft, marked only by the deepening silence of the snow-choked village outside. The lack of visual cues forces the mind to rely upon subtle changes in the environment to gauge the slow progression of the night. The drafts sliding across the floorboards grow colder, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and frozen moisture from the surrounding forest. The structure of the house stiffens in the extreme temperature, the timber joints locking tight against the punishing assault of the storm. The waiting becomes a grueling exercise in mental discipline, requiring a deliberate focus to ward off the creeping anxiety of the isolated dark. You recall the harsh lessons imparted by your mother regarding the careful preservation of the winter harvest. Every grain of rye and every dried pea represents hours of backbreaking labor in the autumn fields, demanding strict rationing to ensure survival until spring. You know the exact location of the suspended sacks hanging from the rafters, protected from the scavenging mice that infiltrate the thatch. The responsibility of managing the food stores falls heavily upon the women, a daily calculation of caloric intake versus the remaining days of the freeze. You swallow against the dry ache in your throat, ignoring the low rumble of hunger that persists in your empty stomach. You picture the small wooden chest resting at the foot of the loft ladder, holding the few items of value your family possesses. Your Sunday dress lies folded within, the dark wool brushed clean of the muddy stains accumulated during the previous week's mass. The garment serves as a visible marker of respectability, required attire for standing before the carved wooden rood screen in the stone church. You remember the stiff texture of the fabric against your collarbone, a sensory detail that separates the holy day from the endless toil of the secular week. The chest also holds a small pouch of iron nails and a spare spindle, practical treasures hoarded against future emergencies. Far away on the perimeter of the settlement, a lone wolf releases a ragged, haunting howl into the teeth of the blizzard. The sound travels across the frozen fields, attenuated by the falling snow, but still carrying a clear message of desperate hunger. The village dogs remain silent in their shelters, refusing to answer the primal challenge issued by the wilderness pressing against the boundaries. The thin wattle fences offer meager protection against the determined predator, relying instead on the deterrent of the human scent and the banked fires. The stark reality of the frontier demands constant vigilance, a wary respect for the lethal forces operating just beyond the edge of the cultivated land. You pull your knees up toward your chest, curling into a tight sphere to maximize the retention of your own body heat. The mattress ticking scratches against your bare ankles, a rough friction that provides a momentary distraction from the pervasive chill of the air. You review the specific steps required to revive the morning fire, a mental rehearsal of the most critical task of the coming dawn. The dry tinder must be coaxed carefully into the glowing embers, feeding the fragile flame before adding the larger oak branches. The success of this operation dictates the temperature of the entire dwelling, a heavy responsibility resting upon your young shoulders. You focus on the rhythmic breathing of your younger brother sleeping in the corner of the main room directly below your position. The boy remains oblivious to the raging storm outside, sheltered by the thick timber walls and the heavy sheepskin covers provided by your parents. He represents the future labor of the household, a pair of growing hands that will eventually wield the heavy iron plow in the fields. You understand his current freedom from the harshest chores is temporary, a brief window of childhood that closes rapidly in the peasant class. The demands of the soil will soon claim his strength, binding him to the same relentless cycle that governed your father's existence. Snow continues to pile against the southern wall of the cottage, creating a natural insulating layer against the biting wind. The muffled quality of the silence grows more pronounced, wrapping the dwelling in a thick acoustic blanket that isolates it from the neighboring structures. The isolation is both comforting and terrifying, a stark reminder of the fragile independence required to survive the deep winter months. The family must rely entirely upon its own resources, unable to seek aid through the impassable drifts blocking the narrow lanes. The structural integrity of the home is the only defense standing between the sleeping inhabitants and the lethal force of the blizzard. You ponder the vast stores of grain held within the Lord's secure stone granaries on the ridge overlooking the valley. The wealth accumulated through the feudal tithe offers absolute protection against the starvation threatening the lower village when the harvest falls short. The physical distance between the manor house and the wattle cottages mirrors the unbridgeable chasm of social class, separating the nobility from the laborers. You accept this disparity as an unalterable fact of creation, a divine hierarchy explained by the priest during the Sunday sermons. The concept of questioning this established order remains entirely alien, a thought that never materializes in the practical mind of a peasant girl. You analyze the distinct scent of the dried lavender woven into the stuffing of your pillow, a fragrant defense against the ever-present vermin. The purple flowers were harvested along the edge of the forest during the brief, intense heat of the passing summer. The careful drying process preserves the essential oils, creating a botanical barrier that discourages fleas from nesting in the rough lemon ticking. The subtle perfume provides a rare touch of sensory grace in an environment otherwise dominated by the smells of labor and livestock. You breathe deeply, drawing the calming scent into your lungs to counter the lingering anxiety of the dark hours. High above the valley, the unseen clouds continue to dump their heavy burden upon the frozen landscape, burying the familiar landmarks. The river Moa slows its current beneath a thickening layer of opaque ice, the vital waterway choked by the relentless, deep freeze. The water wheels of the great mill freeze solid in their wooden casings, halting the production of flour and silencing the grinding stones. The harsh season dictates the terms of existence, enforcing a mandatory pause in the larger economic activities of the region. The people of Domrémy retreat into their individual sanctuaries, waiting for the sky to clear and the long process of digging out to begin. You imagine the intricate patterns your mother weaves upon the heavy wooden loom occupying the far corner of the main room. The steady thud of the beater packing the weft threads creates a rhythmic heartbeat that defines the afternoon hours of the household. The cloth produced carries the specific tension of her hands, a signature weave recognized by the merchants who occasionally purchase the excess yardage. The mastery of this complex machine requires years of patient observation and practice, a skill set passed down through the generations of women. You know you must eventually replicate her precision, ensuring the family remains clothed and the dowry chest slowly fills. You rub your cold nose against the edge of the wool blanket, seeking a brief respite from the freezing air hovering over the bed. The physical discomfort of the loft serves as a constant reminder of the boundary between the relative safety of the dwelling and the deadly exterior. You possess an innate understanding of cold weather survival, a set of instincts honed by a lifetime of exposure to the elements. The necessity of keeping the core warm outweighs all other concerns, demanding tight, curled postures and the hoarding of every available scrap of fabric. The stoic endurance of the peasant class is not a choice but a biological imperative, forged by the brutal environment. Domestic fowls shift uneasily on their low wooden roosts downstairs, their feathers rustling softly in the pitch-black room. The chickens sense the dropping temperature despite the proximity to the banked hearth, huddling closer together to share their meager body heat. Their survival is critical for the spring diet, providing the steady supply of eggs necessary to supplement the dwindling stores of dried grain. The care of the poultry falls strictly within the female domain, adding another layer of daily responsibility to your endless list of chores. The quiet clucking provides a strange sense of companionship in the dark, a shared struggle against the oppressive weight of the winter night. You count the heavy timber rafters supporting the thatch roof, relying on memory to map the invisible architecture overhead. The mental exercise occupies the restless portion of your mind, providing a structured task to ward off the creeping dread of the isolation. The solid oak beams represent the collective labor of the village raised into position during a brief window of good weather years ago. The house is a living document of the community's effort, a sturdy vessel designed to carry the family through decades of seasonal storms. You place your trust in the thick wooden pegs holding the joints, confident the structure will withstand the current assault of the wind and snow. You feel a sudden, sharp ache bloom behind your eyes, a tension headache born from the strain of squinting into the absolute darkness. The lack of visual input forces the other senses into overdrive, exhausting the mind with the effort of interpreting every creak and rustle. You close your eyes, tightly pressing your cold fingertips against your temples to massage the throbbing muscles beneath the skin. The remedy is temporary, offering only a brief relief from the physical manifestation of the mental stress. The long hours of wakefulness exact a heavy toll, draining the vital energy required for the morning's intense physical labor. Sometime later, the relentless hiss of the snow against the thatch begins to slow, tapering off into an intermittent whisper. The violent energy of the storm dissipates, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence that presses against the walls of the cottage. The air in the loft grows incredibly still, the drafts halting as the wind dies down across the buried valley. The temperature stabilizes at a brutal low, locking the accumulated snow into a rigid, icy crust that will require iron tools to break. The darkest portion of the night stretches onward, an unyielding test of endurance for the frozen inhabitants of the medieval village. You map the position of the heavy iron tools resting against the stone foundation of the main floor. The hoe, the sickle, and the heavy axe wait for the morning light, their wooden handles scarred by years of relentless friction. The metal surfaces must be carefully oiled to prevent the damp air from seeding destructive rust across the cutting edges. The maintenance of the equipment dictates the success of the farming season, a constant battle against the corrosive forces of the environment. You understand the value of a sharp blade when the frozen earth resists the planting trenches. You catch the subtle, earthy scent of the stored root vegetables rising faintly from the small cellar pit beneath the floorboards. The turnips and carrots sit packed in dry sand, preserving their dense calories against the threat of rot and freezing temperatures. The cellar represents a triumph of planning, a hidden vault of sustenance that keeps starvation at bay when the snow blocks the hunting trails. The flavor of the winter meals depends entirely upon the condition of those buried roots, adding necessary bulk to the thin barley broths. You mentally calculate the remaining supply, hoping the harvest will stretch until the first spring greens appear along the riverbank. Preparation for the coming day begins in the mind long before the body leaves the rough straw mattress. The sequence of chores must be executed with flawless efficiency to maximize the limited daylight hours available during the winter season. The fire requires immediate attention, followed by the breaking of the ice over the well and the hauling of the heavy water buckets. The animals demand their ration of fodder before the human inhabitants can break their fast with the reheated pottage. The rigid schedule leaves no room for hesitation, enforcing a strict discipline that binds the family to the unyielding demands of survival. You breathe a shallow sigh into the freezing air, watching the white vapor vanish into the oppressive darkness of the loft. The physical sensation of the cold dominates your existence, a persistent ache that settles deep within the marrow of your bones. The endurance required to survive the medieval winter shapes your character, forging a stoic resilience that accepts hardship as the baseline of human life. The romantic notions of the traveling singers hold no truth in this frozen landscape, stripped away by the harsh realities of labor and scarcity. You lie perfectly still beneath the heavy wool, waiting for the first hint of gray light to signal the end of the long night. You hear the blizzard exhaust its fury against the valley, the driving snow tapering off into isolated flakes that drift aimlessly through the frigid air. Massive oak timbers supporting the thatched roof cease their continuous groaning, locking into rigid positions as the temperature plummets. The wattle and daub walls of the cottage hold fast against the accumulating drifts pressing against the southern exterior. A heavy stillness reclaims the settlement of Domrémy, replacing the chaotic howl of the wind with an oppressive silence. The frozen landscape surrenders to the winter, an unbroken expanse of white concealing the rutted lanes and the dormant fields. This isolation severs the small community from the surrounding kingdom until the dawn brings the arduous task of digging out. Frost creeps across the interior surfaces of the timber framing. It draws intricate crystalline patterns over the rough grain of the wood. The freezing air solidifies the ambient moisture, coating the exposed beams with a fragile layer of white rime. A single flake of soot detaches from the stone chimney below. The dying draft carries it upward into the loft. The tiny black particle lands upon the woven linen of the mattress, ticking, a microscopic blemish in the dark. The chill penetrates the heavy wool blanket, seeking out the vulnerabilities where the fabric pulls away from the skin. You draw inward. Your core hoards its generated heat in the center of the chest. You listen to the banked hearth undergo a microscopic shift as the buried oak log fractures down its center. The splitting wood releases a sudden, muffled pop. It echoes sharp and clear in the hushed environment of the dwelling. A tiny plume of gray ash rises from the mound, drifting briefly in the trapped heat before settling over the hearthstone. The iron cooking pot hanging above the embers cools marginally. The metal contracts with a faint, high-pitched ping. The residual scent of the evening pottage lingers in the stagnant air. A savory memory of barley and dried onions clings to the porous wattle walls. You sense the domestic livestock penned at the far end of the cottage succumb to a deeper level of restorative slumber. The heavy pig exhales a long, rattling breath through its snout, burying its bulk further into the dry bracken lining the floor. The goat shifts its cloven hooves. It adjusts its stance without breaking the rhythm of its even respiration. The freed chickens remain motionless upon their low wooden rooster's feathers fluffed outward to trap the vital layer of insulating air. The combined body heat of the animals rises toward the ceiling, mixing with the human warmth to create a distinct thermal zone within the frozen structure. The pungent odor of wet hair and fresh manure forms a protective barrier. This familiar smell defines the boundaries of the peasant sanctuary. You feel the rigid cramp gripping your left calf finally relinquish its hold, leaving a dull, throbbing ache in the tired muscle fibers. The physical release sends a wave of relief traveling up the leg. It loosens the tight knots clustered around the lower spine. The coarse texture of the wool dress scratches against the sharp line of the collarbone. This constant friction generates a minute perimeter of warmth. Your stiff fingers regain their flexibility, the joints unclenching as the blood flow returns to the extremities. The bruised sensation in the palms begins to fade. The memory of the heavy iron hoe and the relentless carding paddles loses its immediate sting. The body accepts the horizontal plane of the narrow bed, mapping the uneven contours of the dried straw stuffing. Medicinal aromas of crushed yarrow drift from the hanging bundles, permeating the loft with a sharp botanical tang. The scent weaves through the dominant odors of old wood smoke and unwashed sheepskin. It creates a layered scent profile unique to this specific household. The air tastes faintly of iron and damp earth. It serves as a stark reminder of the muddy furrows waiting patiently beneath the heavy snowpack. A stray draft slipping through the eaves carries the metallic bite of the open winter sky. This invasive current threatens the fragile equilibrium of the bed. Your lungs draw the freezing oxygen with measured precision. The harsh air is tempered before it reaches the delicate internal tissues. The physical act of breathing becomes a conscious exercise in conservation. You let the looming anxiety regarding the stored root vegetables drain away into the vast emptiness of the night. The mental inventory of the rye grain and the dried peas ceases its relentless rotation through your exhausted mind. The heavy demands of the feudal lord fade from memory. The impending ditch digging and the mandatory tithes are suspended by the overwhelming authority of the blizzard. The rigid obligations defining the peasant class lose their immediate urgency in the unbroken stillness of the pre-dawn hours. Your mind detaches from the endless cycle of agricultural survival. It finds a rare sanctuary in the absence of visual stimuli and pressing chores. The isolation of the dark loft provides a temporary reprieve from the crushing weight of the medieval hierarchy. Across the sleeping platform, the even snoring alters pitch, dropping into a low, resonant vibration. The father's respiration hums through the wooden floorboards, It acts as a physical manifestation of his immense physical exhaustion. The mother's breathing falls into flawless synchronization with his cadence. This matched rhythm is forged by decades of shared labor and mutual endurance. A solitary mouse scuffles near the heavy wooden chest at the foot of the ladder. Its tiny claws scratch uselessly against the hardened dirt below. The minor disturbance highlights the overwhelming silence gripping the remainder of the settlement. A vast ocean of stillness presses against the cottage walls. The shared slumber of the family forms a cohesive unit of survival. You summon the memory of the pale cream dowry cloth materializing on the loom, the fine linen threads crossing in flawless interwoven patterns. The imagined fabric holds the subtle sheen of countless hours spent working the treadle. It stands as physical proof of your mother's unwavering dedication and superior skill. The impending betrothal to the farmer's son loses its terrifying edge. It transforms into a manageable reality governed by practical necessity and shared duties. The transition from the familiar hearth to a new village becomes a required journey. It is a path walked by countless women preceding this generation. The acceptance of this fate settles over your consciousness. It is a stoic surrender to the unyielding structures dictating the path of a woman's life. Heavy iron tools resting against the foundation stones downstairs stand as silent sentinels guarding the interior space. The sickle, the axe, and the spade bear the scars of the rocky earth. Their wooden handles are polished smooth by the constant friction of calloused hands. The metal surfaces wait in the freezing darkness. Their cutting edges are ready to combat the stubborn roots and the overgrown thickets of the spring clearing. The maintenance of these implements dictates the success of the planting season. It is a never-ending battle against rust and the corrosive dampness of the climate. The tools represent the brute force required to extract sustenance from the unforgiving terrain. They are the physical instruments of the lifelong peasant struggle. You picture the communal well in the center of the village remaining locked in its carapace of thick ice. The windlass freezes solid against its wooden supports. The heavy hemp rope hangs rigid in the bitter air, denying access to the vital water resting deep within the earth. The blacksmith's forge sits abandoned and cold. The massive anvil is stripped of the roaring heat that defines its daytime utility. The church stands as a dark monolith against a snow-covered ridge. The painted saints on the frescoed walls stare blindly into the pitch-black nave. The entire settlement exists in a state of suspended animation. The daily activities are halted by the supreme authority of the winter storm. You observe woven willow baskets suspended from the overhead beam swinging imperceptibly in the microcurrents of the loft. The dried reeds hold the remaining supply of winter apples. Their wrinkled skins emit a faint, sweet fragrance that battles the pervasive wood smoke. The meticulous preservation of the fruit demands constant vigilance against rot. It requires a daily inspection performed to ensure the family's survival. The baskets represent the gathered bounty of the autumn orchards. This agricultural triumph is hoarded against the barren months of the freeze. The hanging vessels cast distorted, elongated shadows across the sloping thatch. The scent of the shriveled apples provides a sensory link to the warmer seasons. It acts as a promise of eventual relief from the crushing winter. You mat the supple leather shoes stiffening at the edge of the hearth downstairs as the residual heat dissipates. The rendered mutton fat applied hours ago locks the moisture out of the seams. It preserves the fragile material against the corrosive mud of the lanes. The thin soles bear the exact imprint of the heels and toes that press them into the frozen earth day after day. The footwear acts as the only physical barrier between vulnerable flesh and the lethal elements covering the ground. The shoes wait in the dark alongside the spinning wheel. They are empty vessels anticipating the insertion of cold feet the moment the morning chores commence. The careful maintenance of the leather ensures the continuation of the necessary labor. You track the pulse beating, a measured, deliberate rhythm against your temporal bone, a physical metronome marking the gradual descent into unconsciousness. The radiant heat generated by your core finally conquers the chill trapped beneath the heavy woolen blankets. A secure perimeter of warmth is firmly established. The rough stalks of the straw mattress compress under the shifting weight of your hip. They form a permanent, accommodating groove in the bedding. The tension drains from the muscles of your neck and the rigid line of your jaw. Your physical guard drops as the surrounding environment poses no immediate threat. The mind relinquishes its desperate grip on the waking world. Sensory inputs blur and fade into insignificance. Buried deep within the ash mound, and ember fractures one final time, shifting from pulsing red to a dull, chalky gray. A heavy clump of accumulated snow slews off the edge of the thatched eaves, landing with a muffled thud against the wooden shutters below. The main load-bearing timber of the eastern wall contracts in the freezing air, releasing a low, resonant groan that travels through the floorboards. The faint, greasy scent of extinguished tallow smoke clings stubbornly to the fibers of the linen head covering resting on the wooden chest. The heavy, scratchy wool of the blanket presses a distinct, woven pattern into the tender skin just beneath the point of your chin. A horse stamps its iron-shod hoof against the frozen dirt in the miller's distant stable, the metallic clink carrying clearly through the icy vacuum of the valley. The final sensation is the rhythmic rising of your own chest, a measured motion that mirrors the silent endurance of the sleeping village. You close your eyes, rest well. The dawn will wait until you are ready to face the world again.